Hello and welcome to the first of the three Lancastrian House videos. This is episode 34 of the English Sovereigns podcast, and today's subject is King Henry IV, Bolingbroke. Henry, often called Henry Bolingbroke on account of him being born at Bolingbroke Castle in Lincolnshire, reigned for 14 years between 1399 and 1413. He was the son of John of Gaunt, and he didn't necessarily expect to become king, because John of Gaunt was not the oldest son of King Edward III. Edward the Black Prince was, and Edward the Black Prince had Richard II. So, whilst he was quite high up in the line of succession, Henry himself, I don't think, necessarily expected to become king until the rebellion happened in 1399. So he had some half-siblings called the Beauforts, because John of Gaunt had remarried to a lady named Catherine Swynford out of love, which was quite an unheard of thing at the time, especially in royal circles. And yes, you might have heard of Margaret Beaufort, who was the mother of King Henry VII, and that was how Henry was able to establish his claim to the English throne, at least through a bloodline. So that was that. Henry was playmates with Richard II for a lot of his earlier life, and they were both admitted to the Order of the Garter on the same day. And when Richard and Henry were vaguely getting on during Richard's reign, Richard would be fine with Henry going off, bringing a private army to Lithuania and going on crusades, like in the name of the Order of the Garter. So the Order of the Garter isn't, you might imagine it now just John Major and people like that just milling about at Windsor, but back in the day it was, they actually did some more active military things. So Henry's story, as you might remember from Richard's, kind of begins, and again, if you read Shakespeare, where he has a problem with the Duke of Mowbray, so the Earl of Mowbray, and Richard decides to banish them both, Mowbray permanently, and then Henry for 10 years in exile, and that's where he finds out John of Gaunt dies, and then, as you know, he then rebels against Richard and takes the crown off him, rather than just asking for his lands back. So that's what happened, and then Henry becomes king. But Henry's reign is plagued by some rebellions. So, firstly, from Owen Glyndwr, I don't know how to pronounce that. He was the self-proclaimed Prince of Wales, or the ruler of Wales. He rose up literally in 1400, the year after he managed to take the throne off Richard. And he was eventually followed in this rebellion, was Owen, by Hotspur, who was the Earl of Northumbria, a Percy. You might remember Percy from Blackadder. The descendant of, well, not a descendant, sorry, an ancestor of the fictional Percy, obviously. The Percys had actually been the strongest supporter of Henry's rebellion, but they thought they could control Henry, and Henry wasn't having that. And so Hotspur decided to rebel, and things came to a head at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. And Henry was able to defeat them, but largely this was at the accord of his son, Henry of Monmouth, who would later become Henry V, and, if you didn't know, win at Azincourt, or Agincourt, as you might call it. And yes, this was a big success for him. And he did have some other rebellions that he was dealing with for some of his reigns too, but they're kind of insignificant in comparison to these two. So he was successful in establishing the dynasty and the new regime, I suppose. So I guess he was effective in that regard. In terms of his foreign policy, he hosted Manuel II of the Byzantine Empire. He was the only Byzantine monarch to visit, and actually gave Manuel some money to fight the Ottomans. As you might know, in 1453, the Ottomans would take Constantinople. So it's a long way off yet, but it's only Henry VI's reign. So, and the other foreign policy thing he didn't actually go to war with France, I don't think. He captured James I of Scotland whilst he was just sailing to France, and held him captive there in England for the rest of his life, from 1406 onwards. So that was a bit bad for James, and left him the Scots kind of annoyed at the English again. Anyway, there isn't really much to talk about with Henry. His death is quite sad, I suppose. He became disfigured in the skin, possibly had leprosy or some other skin disease, and he had aged rapidly, and had lots, and therefore, or indeed, as a result, had lost a lot of his initial vigour that he had perhaps shown when he was trying to reclaim his inheritance and take the throne of Richard, or indeed in suppressing the rebellions. He died in March 1413, whilst he was with Parliament in Westminster Abbey. His death was seen by his critics perhaps obviously as God's punishment for taking the throne that was rightfully King Richard II's and for usurping. In terms of his legacy, he, I guess, yes, he established the Lancastrian dynasty. He obviously couldn't have known that Henry VI was, would enjoy the War of the Roses, but, as far as he could see, he'd done a good job. He had a few heirs to spare, along with Henry and Monmouth, and he allowed his body to be buried at Canterbury Cathedral, I think, because he wanted to associate with Thomas Becket, just anything to legitimise the Lancastrian regime, because after all, whilst John of Gaunt, had a good claim to the throne as Edward III's son, really, they had taken the throne off Richard when Richard had a better claim. They were just fortunate that Richard didn't have any children of his own. So that is it for Henry IV's. Next time will be Henry V, who was perhaps one of England's greatest monarchs, or could have been. But there we go. See you later.